Welcome to the Happy Bones, Happy Life podcast. I'm Margie Bissinger, a physical therapist and integrative health coach, and I am your host and guide on our journey to discover the keys to stronger bones, more happiness, and the secrets to live your best life ever. From nutrition to stress, from exercise to happiness, you will gain revolutionary insights from our leading experts. It is time for you to discover the health and happiness you deserve. Hey, Margie here. Are you tired of being tired? Well, if so, you are in the right place, because today we have a fatigue expert as our special guest, Dr. Evan Hirsch, and he's the #1 best-selling author of Fix Your Fatigue, the 4-step process to resolving fatigue, achieving abundant energy, and reclaiming your life. He is also one of the world's leading experts on finding the root causes of fatigue and resolving them naturally. He's helped thousands of people optimize their energy naturally and is on a mission to help 1 million more through his online programs and training of healthcare providers. He works mainly with exhausted, health-conscious, everyday people who can't reach their potential because of fatigue and low energy. He has lectured nationally and internationally on topics in integrative and functional medicine, and is board certified in family medicine and integrative medicine. And in today's talk, we go through fatigue. What are the causes, and what can you do about it? And Dr. Evan talks about his 4-step program to really help fatigue. So stay tuned. Welcome, Dr. Evan. I am really thrilled to have you here because fatigue is something that plagues so many people. I have so many people I work with who tell me that they're just exhausted, they're tired, and they can't seem to understand why. So welcome.
Margie, thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, and this is just such a great topic, especially now, because the thing is, a lot of people, what I find is that people think they have to live with it. They'll go to their doctor and they may have other issues and they say, I'm just exhausted. I'm so tired. And the doctor says, oh, you're stressed, get a little more sleep, or they sort of can brush it off, because I don't think everybody realizes that it really, it can be much deeper, the root cause of this. So before we get started, though, why don't you tell us how you got into working and really specializing in the area of fatigue?
Absolutely. So I'm a conventionally trained MD, so board certified in family medicine and integrative medicine. And my path began really, I was in medical school, graduated, went to residency, met my wife, and we fell in love. And 3 months later, she couldn't get out of bed. And she had fatigue that lasted for 3 years.
Oh, no.
And I couldn't help her. I felt incredibly powerless. Here I am, supposed to be at the height of my educational, educational training, right? And I've got these doctors who I'm asking for their help with fatigue. I'm doing a bunch of research, everything that I can when I'm not working 80 hours a week, and I couldn't help her. In conventional medicine, it's thyroid, it's liver disease, it's heart disease. That's about it, or mono. And that's about it. And so she went through that and she got better, working a lot on her mental emotional state, doing some saunas, supporting her adrenals a bit. And then we got married, had a kid. I graduated residency and started my practice, my medical practice. And then 3 years later, I had fatigue, and it lasted for 5 years.
Oh, no.
And I had just about every single cause of fatigue that I have discovered. So close to 33 different causes of fatigue so far. And I had to go through it one by one, and I really was on my own. Not a lot of people were talking about fatigue back then, and I couldn't get the help that I needed. And frankly, I didn't trust other people. I would go to a doctor here and there, and they just weren't talking the same talk that I was. And I learned that I had to go through this process of replacing the deficiencies, opening the detoxification pathways so that I could remove the toxicities, which we'll get into in a little bit, in order to achieve complete resolution, so that now I feel great, my energy is great, I can run around with my kid, we have dance parties and play tag and I can be there for my wife and all that stuff that I couldn't do before.
Wow. You know, when you live through it yourself, and now you've helped people all over the world with this, that's what's so amazing. Your book's fabulous, and you've done so much to spread the word. So the thing is, how does someone know that this is, because again, a lot of people are just tired. They think, you know, I have whatever it is, our lives can be very, very busy. And how do we separate that it's really fatigue and something that we need to worry about versus, oh, we're just doing too much? So how does someone know that they have fatigue that can be improved?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really comes down to if you're tired and you're sleeping through the night and you're still tired. So it's pretty much tiredness that's not relieved with rest.
Okay.
Right? So sometimes this happens. I mean, when we're in our teens and 20s, we are studying hard, we're pulling all-nighters to study for our finals. And then what happens after our finals? We crash and we sleep for a week. But then we recover. But what ends up happening with some of these chronic stressors that we have in our lives, whether they're mental, emotional, or physical, is that they kind of this slow, decline, and we adapt and we think that we're just getting older. And then all of a sudden we're like, wow, I really need help here. But it's tiredness that's not relieved by rest. And so if you're getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night and you're still having a hard time getting out of bed in the morning, or you're crashing throughout the day, maybe 11 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon is a really big one where people are like, oh my gosh, I have to take a nap, I have to lie down, got to get another cup of coffee, then you know that you need help. I mean, that's the other thing, is that if you're surviving on energy drinks and caffeine, it's time to ask for help.
Okay, great. So let's just dive right in because you have a lot of causes. It's not like one thing, like, okay, fatigue, take this pill. It's not that. It's so much more involved. And that's why I love the work that you do. So should we start delving in to some
Yeah,
of the
let's go.
causes? Yeah. So why don't do you want to start with ones that, well, you start wherever you want. Some of the most
Yeah,
important
yeah, let me
causes.
do an overview first. So don't get
Okay.
overwhelmed by the fact that there's 33 different causes if you're listening to this right now. So those causes can really be grouped into deficiencies and toxicities. So deficiencies are things that are not in the body that are supposed to be in the body. Toxicities are things that are in the body that aren't supposed to be in the body, right? And so with the deficiencies, we're looking at deficiencies in hormones. So this is things like adrenals and thyroid and sex hormones. As you get older and you hit menopause, estrogen goes down, progesterone goes down. Then we're looking at things like nutrients, like low vitamin B12, low vitamin D, low magnesium, low iron. Then we're looking at low lifestyle habits or deficiencies in lifestyle habits. So that's not enough sleep, that's not enough water, not enough movement, not enough good food. So, and all of those things are kind of generally what you're going to get if you go to a naturopath or if you go to an integrative doc or a functional medicine doc. But what they're missing is the toxicities, which we're going to talk about in a second. The last deficiency is mitochondrial deficiency. So, about 70 or 80% of the energy that we produce is from the mitochondria, which is the energy center of every cell in the body except for our red blood cells. And that gets damaged by the toxicities. Okay.
That's a
And
great way to put it because I know people, a lot of people, and we've had people on toxins, but that's a good way to put it that it actually affects the mitochondria, our energy centers. So interesting.
absolutely. And it actually, all those deficiencies are actually caused by the toxicities. So before you go ahead and take a replacement of something, I mean, yes, it can be helpful to boost all those things up, and I do that as part of my program because it's so helpful. But you have to remember that the real cause, it's always a really important thing to ask, keep asking why. Well, why did that happen? Why is that happening? Is that really the cause, or is there a cause below the cause, right? And so that's where we're looking at, the toxicities causing all of these deficiencies,
That's
right?
great. So I know that you use the 4-step process. So maybe would that help starting where you start, like how to, because that's very interesting that you need to start with the toxicities versus the deficiencies. That's
Right. Well, actually, that's a great question. Yeah. So let's jump into that. So, in the four-step process, because that'll put a lot of this into context as well. So, the first step is to assess all the causes. If people don't take anything from this talk, if they take one thing, it's all about the causes. So whether you're dealing with osteoporosis or whether you're dealing with fatigue, like you have to know the cause. Whether you're dealing with a human resources issue at work or whether or not you're trying to fix your car, you have to know what the problem is, right? And with things like fatigue and osteoporosis, there's like multiple problems. There's multiple things that are happening at the time that you need to remedy in order to get resolution and improvement, right? So the first step is to assess for the causes. The second step, and I've found that 75% of the causes can be assessed by symptoms. So you don't even need
Interesting.
labs for 75% of those 33 causes.
That is so refreshing to hear because unfortunately with osteoporosis, you really can't because most people who have bone loss don't even know they have symptoms. It could be silent.
Right.
So that's certainly not the case when it comes to bone loss, but yet many of your causes, because again, the bones aren't in isolation, and many of the causes of fatigue will also cause bone loss. So that's great. Oh, that's good about the symptoms. Keep
That's a good
going.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so assessing the causes is step one. Then step two is replacing those deficiencies that we talked about. So even though I said that, the toxicities, which is step four, getting rid of those is like the number one thing that we have to do, we can't do it first. And we'll talk about why that's the case. But we have to replace the deficiencies in order to deal with any sort of stress that's going to come from removing the toxicities. Okay, because having those toxicities in the body greatly increases stress. We're talking about physical stress here that your hormones and your nutrients are trying to manage, and they can't manage them when those are present, right? So we have to boost these up because that also gets people feeling better very quick. One of the first things I do with people is called the big three. And this is replacing their adrenal gland, which is responsible for managing stress and creating our circadian rhythm and managing insulin and blood sugars and managing our immune system. So all of those things can be supported by supporting the adrenals. And then the mitochondria, like we talked about, 70 to 80% of our energy produced by the mitochondria. And then thyroid. Most people that I see who have low thyroid are grossly undertreated, where a lot of times the doctors are leaning way too hard on their labs. When I lecture to physicians, I say, if you lean too hard on your labs, you're going to fall over. And that's because labs are imperfect. All labs are imperfect. And so that's why also part of my program is focused so much on symptoms. And we combine symptoms plus labs. But even in medical school, when I went to conventional medical school, 90% of a person's diagnosis comes from their symptoms and their history. And then 5% is labs and 5% is physical exams. So very important not to forget about the symptoms.
So in terms of thyroid, can we just go back to that for a minute?
Oh.
Because so many people have Hashimoto's. That's so very, very common.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the people I see also have Hashimoto's, as do I. But I've been able, with diet, lifestyle, totally manage it without medication, without anything. And my labs have been good. But so if someone's labs are okay, what symptoms are you saying that we need to worry about? So someone's labs, they get, their basic lab work on the thyroid and the doctor says, oh, everything's fine.
So the lab work, what you want to see, you have to remember that when you're looking at labs, the normal range is actually a population-based range. It's everybody who's ever taken the test. They create a bell curve and they chop off the top and bottom fifth percentiles and they call that normal. Well, that's not optimal, which is what we're looking for in a functional medicine paradigm. And so your TSH should really be between 0.5 and 1.5. This is the message that comes down from the brain to the thyroid. If it's above 1.5, it means that the brain is yelling at the thyroid to make more thyroid. Okay? And then free T4, then you want to look at the free fractions of thyroid that are floating around in the body. Free T4 should be above 1.2, generally 1.2 to 2.0. And free T3 should be between 3.0 and 4.0. Okay, if they're lower than that, then generally that means that someone's got low thyroid, and 90+% of low thyroid is autoimmune, so it's Hashimoto's. It's the most
That's really
common form.
interesting because oftentimes as screenings, physicians really only test the TSH, and they're missing so much in terms of
Absolutely.
what's really going on. So I think everyone listening, you do want to get, do you usually also get the reverse T3 when you're having people?
I don't anymore because reverse T3 basically just tells you whether or not there's an oxidative stress, which is caused by usually one of the toxicities. And whether or not it's present, I always know that that's the case in the population that I'm dealing in. All the people that I see with fatigue, they all have inflammation from something. The immune system is reacting to one of the toxicities and causing inflammation as it's trying to get rid of those things out of the body because that's its job, right? And so that reaction is also autoimmunity. So like on this spectrum, like you can have allergy, you can have this inflammatory reaction. You can have frank autoimmunity like rheumatoid arthritis or Hashimoto's or whatever, where we actually see the antibodies. And then you can have things like cancer and autism and stuff like that on the furthest side. But all the people that I see with fatigue, they have some degree of autoimmunity.
Great. And most people don't realize that. So then,
Yeah.
okay, so let's continue. I cut you off in the middle of what you.
No worries. So step one, assess the causes. Step two is to replace the deficiencies. And then in order to get to step four, the toxicities, we have to open up the detoxification pathways in step three. So this means opening up the gut, making sure that people are having good stools twice a day, making sure that liver is open, making sure kidneys are open, make sure lymph, which is the garbage can system of the body, is open. So that when we start to remove those toxicities, because if we pull them out of their hiding places in the tissues and we dump them into the lymph, guess what? If the lymph is backed up, or the liver is backed up, or the kidneys is backed up, or you're not pooping, guess what? Those toxicities are going right back into the tissues again.
So I bet people are listening thinking, wait, did he say twice a day? Because
Right.
usually, even when I say once a day, people are like, oh, really? You mean if I go every other day, that's not normal? Because a lot of people,
Absolutely.
we think it's people don't realize that how important that is.
Yeah, and once if it's a really good one once a day, it's okay. But a great example, one of the reasons why I had fatigue was because I was constipated for the first 20 years of my life. I thought that it was normal to have a bowel movement once a week.
Wow.
Yep. And so basically, if you're doing that, you're reabsorbing all of those toxins that are supposed to come out every day. You're reabsorbing them back into your body and you're damaging your mitochondria. You're putting stress on your hormones. You're decreasing your nutrients.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Interesting.
that's opening up the detox pathways. And this is all done with natural stuff. This is vitamins, this is minerals, this is herbs, phytonutrients, stuff like that, foods.
That's what's so great about the work you do, that just like what I believe in terms of helping people naturally, that we can do it and achieve great results. So
Yeah,
great.
and I didn't, as an MD, I didn't believe that that was possible until I actually found some of these tools, some of these herbs and herb combinations that were really potent, where I was actually able to say, oh, okay, I actually don't need to prescribe anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then the toxicities, which is so exciting. We've been talking about these toxicities and we haven't named them yet. So, I call these the usual suspects because they're so common in everything that I see. So, we're talking about heavy metals. So, heavy metals can be mercury. So, over 100,000 pounds of mercury are dumped into our oceans every single year. Lead, from lead paint or lead gasoline, depending on when you were born, a lot of people had exposure.
Actually,
Arsenic.
can we stop there for a second with the lead? I think that's a good point, because even though it's not in our paint anymore and they've removed lead from a lot of things, if you grew up in a period of time where there was lead, it could still be in your system. It's not like you automatically get rid of the lead, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the same for all of these things that I'm going to talk about. So the heavy metals, the next one is chemicals. So chemical toxicity, whether it's plastics, whether it's pesticides, herbicides, all of these things. I have people who come to see me who grew up on a farm, sprayed DDT, haven't had any exposure to DDT as they can tell. We do a test and there's a whole bunch of DDT in their urine.
Wow. Hmm.
So those things just get into the tissues, into the organs, and they're just staying there. And so we have to pull them out and we have to bind them up in order to get them out of the body and make sure those pathways are open. So heavy metals, chemicals, molds. So over 50% of all the buildings in the United States and other first world countries have um, have mold in their homes. And the reason why that is they have water damage, I should say, in their homes, and most of those have mold. And the
50,
reason why,
excuse me, 50%?
yes,
So you're saying, and houses as well, 50%?
houses as well.
So
Houses,
50% of the
offices,
people who are listening to this podcast could have
absolutely.
mold in their house? Wow.
Absolutely. And you don't have to see mold. You know, if you've ever had a flood or a leak or a busted pipe and it was not remediated appropriately, then there is wet, warm drywall or um, particle board or whatever it is that's just fodder for the mold. And so it's growing behind the walls. It doesn't have to necessarily come through. And so, and this is incredibly insidious and incredibly common in the people that I see. And most of, like a huge percentage of the time, when people come to see me, they've already worked on their lifestyle, they've replaced deficiencies. But some of the main things that they haven't addressed are things like mold. And inevitably, somebody's going to be listening to this, or when I see them one on one, they say, I don't have any mold. And I say, okay, fine. Just pay attention, just think about it. And then next time they come back and they say, you know what? Every single winter when I was growing up in Indiana, the basement flooded and there was always a smell. And in fact, we had to get a dehumidifier. And sure enough, we checked their labs, and they've got a whole bunch of mycotoxins, which are mold toxins that are in their urine. And molds can cause fatigue and brain fog and neuropathy, so numbness and tingling, hard time sleeping, awful mood, anxiety, depression. I mean, it's pretty awful, and it's so insidious because it's so hard to test for. But we always it's a two-part process because you have to make sure people aren't living in it. So you have to make sure I have them test their homes and their workplaces, and then also we have to make sure that it's out of their bodies because one of the times that I'm not successful is there's a couple things that happen when they go through this process is if they're living in mold. That's a huge one. Like it's very hard to get people better from fatigue if they're living in mold.
Hmm.
Other things include things like emotional health, where they're not willing or able to kind of work on the emotional toxicity that they've had, abuse, traumas, whatever, rejection of a peer group, whatever it is, the adverse childhood events that end up happening throughout their lives that they're not able or willing to work on, or it just takes a longer period of time. But living in a moldy home is kind of the main thing where I really try to make sure that people understand the importance of this so that they can go out, they can get the testing, they can make sure they're not living in a moldy environment.
So interesting that that's something that's missed probably with huge workups. And that's
Right.
just, yeah. Wow, that's interesting. That's what you see. Wow.
And it's not just Pacific Northwest or Florida. Like you don't have to be in a place with high humidity in order to have it. Like it's high in Arizona as well. Because if you're going to live indoors, this is the joke. Like if you're going to live indoors, you have the potential of having mold. Now you might feel better if you're in a dry climate because the mold inside your body is not blooming. And with a humidity that's greater than 50 or 60%, the mold in your body is going to be blooming
Mm.
and increasing inflammation. So you might feel better outside your home, but you could potentially still get mold from a moldy home even if you're in a dry climate.
You know, it's interesting you say that. Years and years ago, my kids were like getting and me too, getting constant sore throat, you know, constant ear infections. This is when they were putting them on antibiotic. This is a while ago. You know, if I knew now what I know, this wouldn't have happened, but we couldn't figure out. And they just, oh, more antibiotic, more antibiotic. And the truth was, I realized when we were out of the house, this wasn't happening. And it ended up, we had a humidifier that was older and it was full of mold. And it didn't
Mm.
circulate the water. And so it caused all sorts of issues. And the minute we got rid of that, guess what? All the infections stopped and things. And so I think to myself, when pediatricians, when people have chronic ear infections, look at the
Hmm.
house, look at the environment, you
Right.
know, there could be other causes. So it's interesting. So I'm very attuned to
Absolutely.
mold for many reasons. Yeah.
I'm glad you figured that out. I mean, that was a huge help to your family.
You know, I figured it out a little bit too late. That not a little bit too late, but it's interesting because in terms of, you know, now I know a lot more than I had at the time, but they were on in those days. And this is my daughter, let's say she's 26 now, and my son's one of the people. And so they put them on low dose antibiotic. That was the treatment of the chronic ear infections.
Mm.
So wasn't the greatest thing, but anyway, everybody's okay now. So
Good. Well, and the important thing to note on that too is that if you have an exposure to mold when you're 5 for 3 or 6 months, it's still going to be in your body when you're 50 or 60 if you haven't done anything specific to remove it.
Hmm.
So that's the other thing about mold and about fatigue in general is that it's this accumulation of crap, essentially. Your body's like this barrel, and as you go through your life, you accumulate crap. So heavy metals, chemicals, molds. The next one we're going to get to is infections. Whatever it is, it kind of builds up in the body until a tipping point where it starts to overflow. And that's when you get symptoms, and that's when you start to feel compromised and you start to feel more and more tired. And so that's one of the interesting things is that people will say, I know that I lived in a moldy house when I was 10, but I don't think it's been anything since. And, oftentimes that's going to show up in the urine, even if they're not living in it today.
Wow. So your message to people is if you ever, I'm actually going to have us
Right,
tested now. If you ever were exposed to mold in your entire life, you should be tested.
right.
Wow.
Absolutely. And if you are going to get tested, I recommend that you do a urine mycotoxin test. And I can give you a link where people can actually go get this stuff from my store if they want. I've got a lab
Oh,
store where you
oh,
guys can get it.
great. So they do it themselves then, the test?
Yeah, it comes to your home. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
great for COVID time too, but it comes to your home and you urinate into a container and then you send it off to the company and you get the results back.
And then if you get the results that there's mold, what types of treatment do you help people with?
So it's individualized based off of what kind of molds you have in your body, but mainly it's a binder, and you want to use something like charcoal, or there's some French clays that we use, or shilajit, or there's like a number of things that can be supportive. Modified citrus pectin is one of them, but you want to bind it up and then you want to pull it out. So oftentimes we're using glutathione or we're using milk thistle or we're using a number of other things to make sure the detoxification pathways are open. And before I forget, in order to do the test properly, is that you do need to take glutathione, a liposomal glutathione at 500 milligrams twice a day for a week prior to collection.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Because
Can you
what that
explain
does is
why? Yeah.
that's pushing the toxicity out of the tissues so that it can be collected into the urine. Now, if you feel worse at any point, generally it means that you're toxic. You have a lot of toxicity, which is why you're feeling worse because the glutathione is pushing the toxicity into your bloodstream, and then you're essentially being re-exposed if you can't get it out of your body. So if that happens where you start glutathione and you feel worse, immediately do the lab at that point in time. You don't have to wait a week because it means you're
Oh.
pushing it out, you're feeling worse, just do the lab at that time.
And do you, in terms of the detox pathways, because if the detox pathways are, if there's an issue, people will have symptoms. So do you have them do the detox pathways first then,
It
before this
depends.
test, or?
So, I mean, sometimes this is diagnostic,
Mm.
where we can tell whether or not you've got detox pathway issues by doing this test.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Interesting. Wow.
yeah.
And is that one of the big ones that you find that's really missing?
Mold,
Yeah.
huge. Yeah,
Wow.
mold is a big one. Yeah. Any other questions on mold before I move on
No,
to
you can move
infections?
on. It's just so interesting, and maybe because I've had personal experiences with it, and it was a missing link that caused all sorts of issues that, yeah.
Yeah, and I've had all these. So, I lived in a place in medical school that had mold, and only in hindsight. I mean, we had cats that were urinating on cardboard boxes in the basement, and cardboard is like one of the worst things for accumulating mold. They get damp or whatever, and then they just grow it like crazy. They just love to eat that stuff. So, um, yeah, so
How about a
it's
short
important.
exposure? Is there a window of time, in terms of amount of time you're exposed to mold? That's,
It's a great question because we've stayed in Airbnbs before where we've been like, I think there's mold here. And so it really depends on that barrel, how much toxicity you have, how much mold is in there that you're breathing all night. So it really depends. I mean, oftentimes sometimes that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. Sometimes it just adds to the burden. Sometimes it's not super significant. I mean, most of the time you have to live in a moldy environment for 3 to 6 months.
Oh, okay, that was my
Um,
question. Okay.
yeah, but if it's in a separate part of the house, I mean, like oftentimes it's just building up gradually, and it may not be a huge inoculation.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So infections. So there can be infections in the gut, bacteria, yeast, parasites, but the stealth infections are oftentimes really missed. And these are Lyme and Lyme type infections. We're talking about viruses like Epstein-Barr virus or cytomegalovirus or HHV6 virus, which can all cause a mononucleosis type picture. Mononucleosis doesn't have to be from Epstein-Barr, it can be from some of these other ones. And then there's some of these other infections that travel with Lyme and others, which are like Bartonella, which can come from cat scratch fever or from domestic animals in general. So upwards of 50% of domestic animals carry Bartonella. And when people get it, oftentimes they're going to get muscle cramps in their calves, usually at night, pain in the feet. Sometimes it's bone pain. Sometimes it's like a burning pain in the bottom of the feet. Oftentimes they'll have problems sleeping, they'll have thyroid issues, anxiety, depression. And sometimes there's something called babesia that will travel with these other infections, which is considered the North American malaria, where people will have episodic or periodic fevers, like once every couple weeks or once every month. They get a fever at night. Oftentimes they're soaking the sheets periodically. They're also feeling incredibly warm, but it feels differently than a hot flash. They're usually the warmest person in the room. So, and then they also have awful sleep, and then they've got anxiety to the point of panic, and depression sometimes to the point of suicidal thoughts. And then they'll also have sometimes a cough, a dry cough. So all of those are kind of some of those infections that are easily, well, I shouldn't say easily, but are easily identified. And then you can actually focus your treatment. Like I said, it's all about the causes. And if you actually know that one of these infections is causing your fatigue, you can actually be a lot wiser and you can have a lot more success in going after the infection.
Hmm, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then let's see. So we did heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, allergies. So once again, allergies something that are triggering the immune system and causing inflammation. So this can be allergies to food, can be inhaled allergies to the environment, like pollens and whatnot, and to mold. And then negative emotions. That's a really big one that comes up. And it wasn't one that I really understood coming from a physical or a biomedical background, as an MD, and then getting into functional medicine. It's something that I really learned from my wife, who's a mindfulness coach. And what I started implementing in my own life was mindset stuff and working on some of the traumas that I had growing up. And then I started applying that to my patients and clients, and I just saw, much better results with that. So it's just an important part of all this. So my goal really is to make sure that I'm addressing every single effing cause so that I don't miss anything, right?
I love that. You're speaking my language now because as a physical therapist, I very early on in my 20s, I had gone through a very bad situation. People were like, "You're so happy." And I realized then it was an inside job, that happiness.
Mhm.
And so I started teaching that, and as well, because so many people were just swarming with clouds of negativity. And I started teaching different habits to people. And I couldn't get over it. Neck pain, back pain, chronic TMJ started improving. That,
Mhm.
and I've been doing that now. That's part of what I do for the past over 35 years.
Nice.
But it's so interesting that it's an issue with fatigue as well. And so, I just think I think there's no comparison. I think how critical your mindset is and all these issues when it comes to your health in
Right.
general. But it's great that you're saying that, because that's totally what I believe as well. So that's
Yeah,
great that you look
I
at
hope
every
that
single aspect. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that that becomes more and more in the front of everything where, one of the main things that I ask people when they're going through my program is, are you doing your daily mindset practice? And so I'm hopeful that eventually in the medical community, that's going to be the first question that they have coming through the door, right?
Wouldn't that be great? I think I
Yeah,
think I think people are realizing that, and I think they're realizing that a shift can just transform your life. So I
right.
think, everything's important, but we can't miss this piece. And it is something that people can work on and change. It's not like, oh, I'm just a glass half empty person, and that's the way it is. It doesn't have
Right.
to be that way. So
Right.
that's great that you include that as well.
Hmm.
So are those, did we get through all
We
your
got through
stuff?
them all. Yeah. So
Yay!
that's the four-step process. I mean, the last one is electromagnetic frequencies, which is kind of new and sometimes it's not an issue, but once again, it's the barrel approach. So, if you're constantly being exposed to Wi-Fi and things that have a battery that are emitting these magnetic rays at you, and then you get 5G, we know that those things damage your DNA. And a damaged DNA, you carry that through, it becomes metaplasia, dysplasia, and then it can become carcinoma or cancer. So we know that damaging our DNA is a bad idea and increases inflammation. We know actually that mold and mycotoxins will get worse when they're exposed to EMFs. So if you have Wi-Fi on and you've got mold in your home, that's like a double whammy. So I always try to recommend that people turn off their Wi-Fi, especially at night. Plug in. My house is completely wired for Ethernet, and so I recommend that people do that if they can. I try to decrease the amount of dirty electricity that's coming into my home using a Stetzerizer meter, as well as some of these capacitors. So there's a number of different things that you can do to decrease. Once again, it's just another toxicity that needs to be out of your life in order for you to have complete resolution.
That's great. Yeah, I make everyone always, we have people living here now with COVID. So I'm like, the internet must come off at night. There's no question.
Smart, very wise.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. So I have a couple of questions because let's talk
Please.
about some of the things you talked about that I think are so important for our bones as well. So let's talk about vitamin K. What have you seen with fatigue and vitamin K? Because I know that's something that's really not talked about. Well, it's not one of the main things that people say, oh yes, you must, everyone must have enough vitamin K. So
Yeah, so vitamin K is very interesting, especially and specifically vitamin K2,
right.
which is the one that begins with an M. Can't remember the whole word right now. Methanone alone, something like that. But vitamin K2, and the research initially came out of Japan, but was repeated a number of times, showed an 87% decrease in hip fractures in menopausal women. And so this is incredible, for the most part, because it's so important that, I mean, that's really the end result. Do we care about, I mean, right now people are getting DEXA scans and whatnot, and we're looking at the matrix per se and the density, right? We're looking at the density of the bone and determining whether or not, how dense is the bone. And that makes sense to us that the more dense the bone is, the stronger it's going to be, right? But the end result that we really want is a decrease in fractures, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Right? And so we don't really know how this happens. A lot of people believe that it actually has to do with stabilizing the matrix because it does not increase the bone density. So bone density does not increase, but yet you're still getting a decrease in hip fractures. So then what's actually happening? Who knows? And so the supposition is that it's increasing the stabilization of the matrix, of the bone matrix, without increasing the density.
Because it's interesting, some of the other studies on K2 that they did show that it actually reduced the loss of bone in people who were on the MK7. They did a
Uh-huh.
study, a 3-year study, and there's been, reduced also the vertebral height loss. So there's been some really great research on K2 as well as cardiac,
Hmm.
really helping, the cardiovascular system.
Right. Yep.
So
I've read on some of that stuff too. Yes. And
what have you
I,
seen with fatigue in K though? What have you seen?
I haven't seen much.
Oh, okay, okay. And
Yeah.
what about D? Because that's another one that's so absolutely critical. I mean, there's so many that are important for the bones, but the K2, the magnesium, and the D, which are all ones that you alluded to in terms of
Right.
fatigue, are all ones that really, really impact bone health. So have you seen anything, particularly with the magnesium and vitamin D?
Absolutely. Yeah. So vitamin D is actually more of a hormone than a vitamin, as some of your viewers might be aware, and it's so important for immune system function. It's actually an immune system stabilizer, and it helps to regulate Th1 and Th2 autoimmunity. So we were talking about how these toxicities will cause a degree of autoimmunity where the immune system is reacting to them. The vitamin D ends up kind of stabilizing some of this. So oftentimes at higher dosing, it can be especially helpful, and consequently, it can help boost people's moods as well as their energy. So I always recommend that people take vitamin D, usually around 5,000 or 10,000 international units. But interestingly, and this is a little bit more advanced, but it can also increase cytokine activity. And so as we kill off bugs and whatnot, we can get what's called a Herxheimer reaction, which is where the toxicities from the infections are being released into the body. The body mounts a cytokine reaction, which is an aspect of the immune system. And if you are taking vitamin D, that reaction or feeling worse can actually be worse. So there are times sometimes where we'll say, okay, well, let's remove the vitamin D for a period of time. Let's get these pathways open, detoxification pathways open, and then come back in and then add the vitamin D back in because it is so supportive for the immune system.
So that's when someone is really working with a practitioner or with you that
Yes,
you can really figure that out. Very
absolutely.
interesting.
Hmm.
That's great. So, yeah, I'm
And
sorry.
then magnesium is involved in over 550 different enzymatic reactions in the body, and is just it's an important part of stress management. So the adrenal gland really needs magnesium. Magnesium is actually the main tool that I use for increasing bowel movements. So I recommend that people take a product called citramate, or it's basically magnesium citrate, and we just have them increase by a capsule every 3 days because there's this delay from when you take your magnesium and when it actually comes out the other end. So to prevent you from getting diarrhea, and you get to a point where you're having, two good bowel movements a day, and then you go a little bit further and then it's a little bit too loose and you come back to the right dose for you. And it's helpful in so many different aspects. It helps to relax smooth muscle in the body, so it's wonderful for relaxing the blood vessels. um, it's a natural muscle relaxer. It really helps with sleep as well and central nervous system relaxation. So it's ubiquitous in the body and very important to replace.
That's great. So yeah, the other thing I didn't mention with so the K2 and the magnesium also help the calcium get into the bones and out of the soft, the K2 also sweeps it out of the soft tissue. So I think it's so important if people are, getting all this calcium, which everyone's making a big deal about, they absolutely need the K2, the magnesium, and the vitamin D as well. So that's great. That's so interesting. So how do you know if you can help someone with that fatigue? So someone, the person, I guess, with all the testing, or what would you say?
So it's really about the causes, once again. So have they addressed all the causes? Because I've never met anybody who has found all of their causes and addressed them and still has fatigue.
Yay, that's such good news
Yeah.
that, right, that people don't have to, I mean, people must feel so great when they address the causes and
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's huge because then you actually know what to focus on, you know, that there are these causes and that you need to really focus as specifically as possible so that you can resolve them.
that's great. And you also have a program so that people don't, right? You want to just tell everyone about your program a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my program is a Fix Your Fatigue program. I have a number of different levels that are available if people want mentorship, but then I also have a course right now, which is at a discount at $597. And it takes you through that 4-step process. It also includes the 70 plus page workbook, which takes you through all of those symptoms that I talked about so that people can take that workbook, they can look at their causes, and they can figure out, 75% of all of the potential causes that they have. And then they know exactly what labs they need to spend money on in order to get the other answers that they need. And I have a Facebook group that I'm in all the time to help people go through this process. And if at any point they end up coming up against some barriers, I've got additional support to help them. I've got a nervous system retraining coach, which is wonderful for the emotional stuff, and the limbic system, retraining the limbic system. And then I also have a health coach, and then I obviously have myself for one-on-ones.
Oh, that's great because nobody wants to be fatigued. I mean, nobody it's just something that we want to enjoy our lives. We want to have that energy, wake up in the morning and ready to just attack the day. And if you're not, don't live like that. Am I right, Dr. Evan? There's just no reason that people have to think that that's their life, because there are reasons and there are treatments. And I think that's why I love the work you do, because it's so important. I just feel sad sometimes when you see people and they're like, oh, I have no energy. I never have. And I see this a lot. I really do. That people really need, it's an issue. And that's why I was so happy to have you on. So
Yeah, it's the great thief of our lives, I mean, it destroys families. I mean, it just about destroyed my business, just about destroyed my relationships with my wife and my kid. I couldn't be there for them. And so that's why I'm on a mission to help 1 million people resolve their fatigue. I mean, 50% of people fall asleep at work. 69% of people, their fatigue is compromising their cognitive function at work. So that's 107 million people out of 160 million people in the workforce. Like it's an epidemic right now, and it's so important that people get this information. So I really appreciate you having me on.
oh, and you also have a great book as well.
Yes, I do. Thank you. It's
Yeah,
on
same.
Amazon.
Yeah, that's great. So this has been is there anything else that you want to tell anybody or give any advice before we end? Is there any special things you'd like to leave people with?
Well, I think that, maybe some of the most important stuff is, find your causes and don't ever stop. Keep on finding the information. Sometimes you have to kiss a lot of frogs to meet a prince. Like sometimes it's just the next step, like this is the next practitioner who's going to help you. Give them 3 months or 6 months. And then if you're not getting anywhere, then move on to the next one. I of course think that my program is amazing because I address all of these causes, but if for some reason you're not able to jump into them, just keep moving and keep finding answers and focus on the causes. Don't focus on diagnosis, because who cares if you have a diagnosis that's basically, giving you a name for all of these symptoms that you have, because that diagnosis is not going to be treating these causes.
I love that. And that's my belief, that you dig deep and you don't stop. And I think I had my husband, he had an autoimmune issue on the podcast, and that was his message as well. You can't stop because there's more, and you just need to keep digging and find the right information and the right person to work with. And because life is too precious, or,
Right.
Who doesn't want, now you're enjoying life, having fun. I believe everybody should do that so they can, embrace the day and embrace this life, because it's,
It's the one life we got.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I will have all the links. Actually, I will, for those who are listening, the program, I made them easy so that people can write them down. They'll be in the show notes, all the links. But
Nice.
Dr. Evans' course is called, if you just go to tinyurl.com/fixyourfatigue-course, that will give you the link to the course. And then to your website, where you have all sorts of great information as well, and different things. It's tinyurl.com/improve-energy. So, but I'll have the links in the show notes that you could just click. So that makes it easy. But
Awesome. Thanks for doing that.
I can't thank you enough. I think you've given us great information. I can't wait to hear from the listeners. I want people to let us know if, when they do something and it improves or something has clicked with you, because I guess that's what excites me so much. Then that's why I have the podcast, because someone's listening and they didn't even think of mold. They're exhausted. They barely could get through their day. And this may be one of their causes or something that you mentioned. And that's what excites me. And that's why I love doing this. And it's been such a pleasure to have you on. So thank you so much. And I look forward to staying in touch. And thanks again.
Likewise, Margie. Thank you.
Thanks. I hope you've enjoyed today's interview with Dr. Evan as much as I have, and now have a better understanding of what may be causing your fatigue and what you can do about it. All the links that we mentioned are in the show notes. Bye for now, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Happy Bones, Happy Life podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe on your favorite listening app so that you don't miss any amazing insights on upcoming episodes. And until next time, continue to live your best life ever. See you soon.